All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. I'm on chapter 11, Changing Economic Patterns. Okay, so we got introduction, Great Britain, Germany, France, the United States of America, the economic factors, the results of economic depression, the pluralist economy, and world blocks. It's on page 497. Link to the PDF in the description. All right, introduction. An economic system does not have to be expansive, that is, constantly increasing its production of wealth, and it might well be possible for people to be completely happy in a non-expansive economic system if they were accustomed to it. In the 20th century, however, the people of our culture have been living under expansive conditions for generations. Their minds are psychologically adjusted to expansion, and they feel deeply frustrated unless they are better off each year than they were the preceding year. The economic system itself has become organized for expansion, and if it does not expand, it tends to collapse. The basic reason for this maladjustment is that investment has become an essential part of the system, and if investment falls off, consumers have insufficient incomes to buy the consumer's goods, which are being produced in another part of the system, because part of the flow of purchasing power created by the production of goods was diverted from purchasing the goods it had produced into savings, and all the goods produced could not be sold until those savings came back into the market by being invested. In the system as a whole, everyone sought to improve his own position in the short run, but this jeopardized the functioning of the system in the long run. The contrast here is not merely between the individual and the system, but also between the long run and the short run. So this is kind of like getting into like Keynesian economics or whatever, modern monetary theory, where you basically, inflation's so bad that you have to spend the money now because it will be worth nothing in the future. Okay. The 19th century had accepted one of its basic faiths, the theory of the harmony of interests. This held that what was good for the individual was good for society as a whole, and that the general advancement of society could be achieved best if individuals were left free to seek their own individual advantages. This harmony was assumed to exist between one individual and another, between the individual and the group, and between the short run and the long run. In the 19th century, such a theory was perfectly tenable, but in the 20th century it could be accepted only with considerable modification. As a result of persons seeking their individual advantages, the economic organization of society was so modified that the action of one person were very likely to injure his fellows, the society as a whole, and his own long-range advantage. This situation led to such a conflict between theory and practice, between aims and accomplishments, between individuals and groups, that a return to fundamentals in economics became necessary. Unfortunately, such a return was made difficult because of the conflict between interests and principles, and because of the difficulty of finding principles in the extraordinary complexity of 20th century economic life. The factors necessary to achieve economic progress are supplementary to the factors necessary for production. Production requires the organization of knowledge, time, energy, materials, land, labor, and so on. Economic progress requires three additional factors. These are innovation, savings, and investment. Unless a society is organized to provide these three, it will not expand economically. Innovation means devising new and better ways of performing tasks of production. See, this is one of the things that Max Kaiser pointed out, that because we don't have like production, like factory floor production anymore, is part of the reason why Americans aren't innovating anymore, and that might even be one of the reasons why they took away so much factory floor production, is because that's where the innovations happen. Like when you keep on working on widgets and then you figure, hey, well, maybe if we move this machine over here and do this with that, then it'll make the widgets come out better. But then you'd have to get the credit for coming up with that, right? And so we don't have as much innovation because we don't have as much production, right? Like as Henry Ford, he was like producing cars, and that's how he came up with the assembly line, because he's like, well, let's figure out better ways to produce it. But since nobody produces anything, there's no point in figuring out better ways to produce it, right? Savings means refraining from consumption of resources so that they can be mobilized for different purposes. And investment means the mobilization of resources into new, better ways of production. The absence of the third factor, investment, is the most frequent cause of a failure of economic progress. It may be absent even when both of the other factors are working well. In such a case, the savings accumulated are not applied to inventions but are spent on consumption, on ostentatious social prestige, on war, on religion, on other non-productive purposes, or even left unspent. Economic progress has always involved shifts in productive resources from old methods to new ones. Such shifts, however beneficial, are certain groups, beneficial to certain groups, and however welcome to people as a whole, were bound to be resisted and resented by other groups who had vested interests in the old ways of doing things and in old ways of utilizing resources. In a progressive period, these vested interests are unable to defend their vested interest to the point of preventing progress. But obviously, if the groups in a society who control the savings, which are necessary for progress, are the same vested interests who benefit by the existing way of doing things, they are in a position to defend those vested interests and prevent progress merely by preventing the use of surpluses to finance new inventions. Sounds like the boomers. Such a situation is bound to give rise to an economic crisis. Sounds like the boomers. From one narrow point of view, the 20th century's economic crisis was a situation of this type. As a matter of fact, I'm about to put a post-it note on that. To understand how such a situation could arise, we must examine the development in the chief capitalist countries and discover the causes of the crisis. I can tell you right now, it was the boomers. All right. Great Britain, page 499. In Britain, throughout the 19th century, the supply of capital was so plentiful from private savings that industry was able to finance itself with little recourse to the banking system. The corporate form was adopted relatively slowly, and because of the benefits to be derived from limited liability rather than because it made it possible to appeal to a widespread public for equity capital. Savings were so plentiful that the surplus had to be exported, and interest rates fell steadily. Promoters and investment bankers were not much interested in domestic industrial securities, except railroads, and for most of the century concentrated their attention on government bonds, both foreign and domestic, and on foreign economic enterprises. Financial capitalism first appeared in foreign securities and found a fruitful field of operations. The corporation law, as codified in 1862, was very lenient. There were very few restrictions on formations of companies and none on false prospectuses or false financial reports. Holding companies were not legally recognized until 1928, and no consolidated balance sheet was required then. As late as 1933, of 111 British investment trusts, only 52 published a record of their holdings. This element of secrecy is one of the outstanding features of English business and financial life. The weakest right an Englishman has is the right to know, which is about as narrow as it is in American nuclear operations. Most duties, powers, and actions in business are controlled by customary procedures and conventions, not by explicit rules and regulations, and are often carried out by casual remarks between old friends. No record perpetuates such remarks, and they are generally regarded as private affairs which are no concern of others, even when they involve millions of pounds of the public's money. Although this situation is changing slowly, the inner circle of English financial life remains a matter of whom one knows rather than what one knows. Jobs are still obtained by family, marriage, or school connections. Character is considered far more important than knowledge or skill, and important positions on this basis are given to men who have no training, experience, or knowledge to qualify them. Sounds like Hunter Biden and the Burisma thing. As part of this system, at the core of English financial life have been 17 private firms of merchant bankers who find money for established and wealthy enterprises on either a long-term investment or short-term acceptances basis. These merchant bankers, with a total of less than 100 active partners, include the firms of Baring Brothers, N.M. Rothschild, J. Henry Schroeder, Morgan Grenfell, Hambros, the Lazard brothers. These merchant bankers, in the period of financial capitalism, had a dominant position with the Bank of England, and, strangely enough, still have retained some of this, despite the nationalization of the bank by the Labour government in 1946. As late as 1961, a Baring, Lord Cromer, was named governor of the bank, and his board of directors, called the Court of the Bank, included representatives of Lazard, of Hambros, and of Morgan Grenfell, as well as of an industrial firm, English Electric, controlled by these. The heyday of English financial capitalism is associated with the governorship of Morgenthau Norman from 1920 to 1944, but it began about a century after the advent of industrial capitalism, with the promotion of Guinness Limited by Barings in 1886, and continued with the creation of Soaps Limited by the Westminster Bank in 1887. In the latter year, only 10,000 companies were in existence, although the creation of companies had been about 1,000 per year in 1870s and about 2,000 per year in the 1880s. Of the companies registered, about a third fell bankrupt in their first year. This is a very large fraction when we consider that about one half of companies created were private companies which did not offer securities to the public and presumably already were engaged in a flourishing business. Financial capitalism really took root in Britain only in the 1890s. In 2 years, 1894 to 1896, E.T. Hooley promoted 26 corporations with various noble lords as the directors of each. The total capital of this group was £18.6 million, of which Hooley took $5 million for himself. From this date onward, financial capitalism grew rapidly in Britain, without ever achieving the heights it did in the United States or Germany. Domestic concerns remained small, owner-managed and relatively unprogressive, especially in the older lines like textiles, iron, coal, shipbuilding. One chief field of exploration for British financial capitalism continued to be in foreign countries until the crash of 1931. Only after 1920 did it spread tentatively into newer fields like machinery, electrical goods, and chemicals. And in these, it was suspended almost at once by monopoly capitalism. As a result, the period of financial capitalism was relatively weak in Britain. In addition, its rule was relatively honest, in contrast to the United States, but similar to Germany. It made little use of holdings companies, exercising its influence by interlocking directorates and direct financial controls. It died relatively easily, yielding control of the economic system to new organizations of monopoly capitalism constructed by men like William H. Lever, Viscount Leverhulme, 1851 to 1925, or Alfred M. Mond, Lord Melchet, 1868 to 1930. The former created a great international monopoly in vegetable oils centering upon Unilever, while the latter created the British chemical monopoly known as Imperial Chemical Industries. Financial capitalism in Britain, as elsewhere, was marked not only by a growing financial control of industry, but also by an increasing concentration of this control and by an increasing banking control of government. As we have seen, this influence of the Bank of England over the government was an almost unmitigated disaster for Britain. The power of the bank in business circles was never as complete as it was in government because British businesses remained self-financing to a greater extent than those of other countries. This self-financing power of business in Britain depended on the advantage which it held because of the early arrival of industrialism in England. As other countries became industrialized, reducing Britain's advantage and her extraordinary profits, British business was forced to seek outside financial aid or reduce its creation of capital plant. Both methods were used, with the result that financial capitalism grew at the same time as considerable sections of Britain's capital plant became obsolete. The control of the Bank of England over businesses was exercised indirectly through the joint stock banks. See, British love that indirect rule. That's probably like one of their most successful, I guess, political tactics, but really it's used in politics and business. Pretty much, you can use it in anything. The whole indirect rule thing where you basically just make their leaders basically follow you, but you never actually officially take over, but you take over the leaders. These banks became increasingly concentrated and increasingly powerful in the 20th century. The number of such banks decreased through amalgamation from 109 in 1866 to 35 in 1919 and to 33 in 1933. This growth of a money trust in Britain led to an investigation by a Treasury Committee on bank amalgamations. In this report, Colwyn Report of 1919, this committee admitted the danger and called for government action. but the government's run by the bank. A bill was drawn up to prevent further concentration, but was withdrawn when the bankers made a gentleman's agreement to ask the Treasury permission for future amalgamations. Basically, they bribed them. The net result was to protect the influence of the Bank of England, since this might have been reduced by complete monopolization of joint stock banking, and the bank was always in a position to influence the Treasury's attitude on all questions. See, the bank in a capitalist society, the bank is in a position to influence everyone's position and attitude on all questions. That's the whole point. It's capitalism, and they're the bank. Of the 33 joint stock banks existing in 1933, 9 were in Ireland, 8 in Scotland, leaving only 16 for England and Wales. The 33 together had over 2,500 million in deposits. I guess that's 2.5 billion. In April 1933, of which 1,773 million were in the so-called Big Five: Midland, Lloyd's, Barclays, Westminster, and National Provincial. The Big Five controlled at least 7 of the other 28, in one case by ownership of 98% of the stock. Although competition among the Big Five was usually keen, all were subject to the powerful influence of the Bank of England as exercised through the discount rate, interlocking directorships, and above all through the intangible influences of tradition, ambition, and prestige. In Britain, as elsewhere, the influence of financial capitalism served to create the conditions of monopoly capitalism, not only by creating monopoly conditions, which permitted industry to free itself from financial dependency on the banks, but also by insisting on those deflationary, orthodox financial policies which eventually alienated industrialists from financiers. Although monopoly capitalism began to grow in Britain as far back as the British Salt Union of 1888, which controlled 91% of the British supply, the victory of monopoly capitalism over financial capitalism did not arrive until 1931. By that year, the structure of monopoly capitalism was well organized. The Board of Trade reported in 1918 that Britain had 500 restrictive trade associations. In that same year, the Federation of British Industries, FBI, had as members 120 trade associations and 704 firms. It announced that its goal would be the regulation of prices, the curtailment of competition, and the fostering of cooperation in technical matters, in politics, and in publicity. By 1935, it had extended this scope to include A. Elimination of excess productive capacity, B. Restrictions on entry of new firms into the field, and C. Increasing duress on both members and outsiders to obey minimum price regulations and production quotas. That doesn't sound like capitalism at all. That sounds like government, state-run, socialist, central planned production. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is what capitalism is really supposed to be like: free trade with government restricting people from entering and increasing, and putting duress on both members of their trade guild and non-members to have minimum price regulations. That's not capitalism, I'm sorry. This last ability was steadily strengthened in the period 1931 to 1940, Probably the greatest achievement in this direction was a decision of the House of Lords, acting as a Supreme Court, which permitted the use of duress against outsiders in order to enforce restrictive economic agreements. The case of Thorne v. Motor Trade Association, decided June 4, 1937. The year 1931 represented for Britain the turning point from financial to monopoly capitalism. In that year, financial capitalism, which had held the British economy in semi-depression for a decade, achieved its last great victory when the financiers, led by Morgenthau Norman and J.P. Morgan, forced the resignation of the British Labour government. But the handwriting was already on the wall. Monopoly had already grown to such a degree that it aspired to make the banking system its servant instead of its master. The deflationary financial policy of the bankers had alienated politicians and industrialists and driven monopolist trade unions to form a united front against the bankers. This was clearly evident in the Conference on Industrial Reorganization and Relationship of April 1928. This meeting contained representatives of the Trade Union Congress and the Employers' Federation and issued a memorandum to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, signed by Sir Alfred Mond of Imperial Chemicals and Ben Turner of the Trade Unions. Similar declarations were issued by other monopolist groups, but the split of monopolist capitalist and of financial capitalist could not become overt until the latter were able to get rid of the labor government. Once that was achieved, labor and industry were united in opposition to the continuance of the bankers' economic policy with its low prices and high unemployment. The divisive event which caused the end of financial capitalism in Britain was the revolt of the British fleet at Ivor-Gordon on September 15, 1931, and not the abandonment of gold 6 days later. The mutiny made it clear that the policy of deflation must be ended. As a result, no real effort was made to defend the gold standard. With the abandonment of gold and the adoption of a protective tariff, monopolist capitalists and labor joined in an effort to raise both wages and profits by a program of higher prices and restrictions on production. The old monopolies and cartels increased in strength and new ones were formed, usually with the blessings of the government. These groups enforced restrictive practices on their members and on outsiders, even to the extent of buying up and destroying productive capacity in their own lines. In some cases, as in agricultural products and in coal, these efforts were based on statute law, but in most cases, they were purely private ventures. In no case did the government make any real effort to protect consumers against exploitation. In 1942, a capable observer, Herman Levy, wrote, "Today in Britain is the only highly industrialized country in the world where no attempt has yet been made to restrict the domination of quasi-monopolist associations in industry and trade." It is true that the government did not accept the suggestions of Lord Melchett and the Federation of British Industries that cartels and trade unions be made compulsory, but it gave such free rein to these groups in the use of their economic power that the compulsory aspect became largely unnecessary. By economic and social pressure, individuals who refused to adopt the restrictive practices favored by the industry as a whole were forced to yield or were ruined. This sounds like every industry now. This, for example, was done to a steel manufacturer who insisted on constructing a continuous strip steel mill in 1940. Among the producing groups, social pressures were added to economic duress to enforce restrictive practices. A tradition of inefficiency, high prices, and low output became so entrenched that anyone who questioned it was regarded as socially unacceptable and almost a traitor to Britain. As the economist, the only important voice in the country was restricted. Oh, oh. As the economist, the only important voice in the country which resisted this trend, said on January 8, 1944, too few British businessmen are trying to compete. In these days, to say that a firm has so increased its efficiency that it can sell at low prices is not to give praise for initiative and enterprise, but to criticize it for breaking the rules of fair trading and indulging in the ultimate sin of cutthroat competition. No detailed analysis of the methods or organization of these restrictive groups can be made here, but a few examples may be indicated. The Coal Mines Act of 1930 set up an organization which allotted production quotas to each colliery and fixed minimum prices. The National Shipbuilders Security Limited was set up in 1930 and began to buy up and destroy shipyards using funds from a £1 million bond issue whose service charges were met from a 1% levy on construction contracts. By 1934, 1/4 of Britain's shipbuilding capacity had been eliminated. The Millers Mutual Association, 1920, entirely suppressed competition among its members and set up the Purchase Finance Company to buy up and destroy flour mills using funds secured by secret levy on the industry. By 1933, over 1/6 of the flour mills in England had been eliminated. In textiles, the Lancashire Cotton Corporation acquired 10 million cotton spindles in 3 years, 1934 to 1937, and scrapped about half of these. Kind of sounds like what they were doing with the eggs during COVID. They're like, oh, these chickens got COVID with no proof, and then they just destroyed tons of eggs, cows, chickens. Sound familiar? While these spindle board scrapped about 2 million spindles in 1 year, 1936 to 1937. In spite of the growing international crisis, these restrictive actions continued unabated until May 1940, but the drive towards total mobilization by the Churchill government brought a fuller utilization of resources in Britain than in any other country. This wartime experience with full employment made it impossible to return to the semi-stagnation and partial use of resources which had prevailed under financial capitalism in the 1930s. However, the economic future of Britain in the post-war period was much hampered by the fact that the two opposing political parties represented entrenched economic interests that were not a rather amorphous grouping of diverse interests as in the United States. The Labor Party, which held office from 1945 to 1950 under the Clement Attlee, represents the interest of labor unions and, in a more remote fashion, of consumers. The Conservative Party, which held office under Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, and Douglas Home after 1951, represents the propertied classes and still continues to show strong banking influence. This has created a kind of balance in which a welfare state has been established, but at the cost of slow inflation and slack use of resources. Consumption and enjoyment of leisure rather than production have been the marks of the British economy even under the Conservative Party, which has shown more concern for the value of the pound in the foreign exchanges than it has for productive investment. The middle classes, and above all, the professional and educated groups, are not directly represented by the party. Their shift from one of these alien parties to another by their shift from one of these alien parties to another, they can determine the outcome of elections, but they are not really at home in either and may ultimately turn back to the Liberal Party, although they are reluctant to embark upon the period of coalition, and they are relatively irresponsible governments this might entail. Basically, they're saying that neither the conservative or liberal party really represents the middle class or basically college educated people, and people just go back and forth between the parties because they realize that the government doesn't do anything anyway for them. Like, people can kind of see that it's only working for rich people. But okay. The class structure in Britain, which has survived the war in spite of steady attrition, is still being eroded, not by any drastic increase in working class people rising into the upper class, but by the development of the third class, which belongs to neither of the old classes. This new group included the people with know-how, managers, scientists, professional men, imaginative, parvenu entrepreneurs in lines which the older possessing classes had ignored, kind of like streamers. These newly established rich now try to ignore the old upper classes and frequently show surprising resentment towards it, kind of like streamers. As this new, amorphous, vigorous group, which unfortunately has no common outlook or ideology, increases in numbers, sounds like streamers, it blurs the outlines of two older classes. Much of this blurring has been the result of adoption of upper class characteristics by non-upper class persons. Increasing numbers of young people are adopting the British Broadcasting Corporation accent, that's called received pronunciation, which makes it increasingly difficult to establish the class, educational, and geographic origin of a speaker. Which that's something that's really big in Britain, is like that people can be able to identify like what region or even what part of like London you're from based on your accent. And yeah, it's kind of gone away. I've noticed that too with Australian people. They don't have as thick of an accent anymore either. It's like, I guess, TV. Everybody watches like British TV. Closely related to this is the improved appearance and health of the ordinary Englishman as a consequence of rising standards of living in general and the advent of the National Health Service in particular. The loss of these two identifying characteristics leaves clothing as the chief class distinctive mark, but this applies only to men. Many women, as a result of the wide spreading of style magazines and the influence of the cinema, wearing similar dresses, use the same cosmetics, and adopt the same hair arrangements. Today, even relatively poor shop girls are often well dressed and invariably are attractively clean and carefully coiffed. Coiffered. I forget how to. Okay. Coiffered. As in most other countries in the post-war world, post-ward, WARD. Okay. As in most other countries in the post-war world, Britain's economy is increasingly made up of large blocks of interest groups whose shifting alignments determine economic policy within the three-cornered area of consumers' living standard. investment needs, and government expenditures, chiefly defense. All these diverse interest groups are increasingly monopolistic in organization and increasingly convinced of the need for planning for their own interest, but the major factor in the picture is no longer the banking fraternity as it was before the war, but the government through the Treasury. This decrease in the power of bankers, with a corresponding increase in that of other groups, including the government, is not the result of any new laws, such as the nationalization of the Bank of England, but of shifts in the flows of investment funds, which increasingly bypass the banks. Many of the largest industrial enterprises, such as British Imperial Chemicals or Shell Oil, are largely self-financing as the result of monopolistic conditions based on cartels, patent controls, or controls of scarce resources. At the same time, the great mass of investment funds came from non-banking sources. About half of such funds now comes from the government and public authorities, such as the National Coal Board, which produces £17 million a year in new money seeking investment. Insurance companies concerned with non-life policies are fairly closely linked with the older banking structure as they are in most countries, but the banks ignored insurance on lives, which in England developed as a lower class concern paid by weekly or monthly premiums through door-to-door collections. These insurance companies in Britain provide £1.5 million a day in money seeking investments, 1961, and the largest company, the Prudential, pours out £2 million per week. Much of this goes into industrial shares. In 1953, when the Conservative Party denationalized the steel industry, which Labor had nationalized in 1948, much of its shares were brought up by funds from insurance companies. These enormous funds create a great danger that the handful of unknown men who handle the investment of such funds could become a centralized power in the British economic system. Well, it seems like that happens everywhere. I mean, once they control the health system, it's like the health system, the food system, the education system, if it becomes monopoly controlled, your society's pretty much done for. So far, they have made no effort to do so, since they supply funds without interfering in the existing management of the corporations in which they invest. They are satisfied with an adequate return on their money, but the possibility of such control exists. Another source of funds from lower class sources is the postal savings system. This has expanded because the lower classes in England regard banks as alien, upper class institutions and prefer to put their savings somewhere else. As a result, postal savings at over £6,000 million are about the same size as the deposits of all the 11 joint stock banks. Somewhat similar in character are the investments of pension funds, which reached a total of about £2,000 million at the end of 1960 and are increasing to about £150 million per year. Two other lower class non-banking innovations which have been having revolutionary influences on British life are the building societies called Building and Loan in the United States and hire purchase associations, installment buying organizations, which help the lower classes to acquire homes and to equip them. Together, these have wiped away much of the traditional dinginess of English lower-class life, brightening it up with amenities which have contributed to increase the solidarity of family life. slum clearance and rebuilding by local government bodies, the so-called council houses, have added to this. One consequence of the flowing of investment funds outside the control of the banks has been that the traditional controls on consumption and investment by the use of changes of bank rates have become decreasingly effective. This has had the double effect of dampening down the movements of the business cycle and shifting such controls to the government, which can regulate consumption by such devices as changes in the terms of installment buying, larger down payments, and carrying charges. At the same time, Britain's formerly independent role in all these matters has come increasingly under the influence of outside, uncontrollable influences such as business conditions in the United States, the competition of the European Common Market, and the pressures of various international agencies such as the International Monetary Fund. The final result is a complex and increasingly feudalized social welfare economy in which managers rather than owners share power in a complicated dynamic system whose chief features are still largely unknown, even to serious students. All right, let's see what this Germany section has. Alright, I'll just stop there because the next section is Germany. So like 45 minutes, whatever. Alright, so I mean, that part was pretty straightforward. I mean, there's not much there. Just the switching over from monopoly capitalism to financial capitalism, which monopoly capitalism just means that, like, it's kind of makes more sense that the people that run the certain industries, like say like the beef industry, like it's kind of like the most efficient company would take over and buy out all the other beef companies and cattle farms. Kind of, I mean, it's not good, but it makes sense. But then the financial capitalism means that now the banks just control every industry, whether it's beef or iron, steel, coal, textiles. The banks just control all of it, and they don't directly affect anything because they have the whole managerial class or whatever, but they could, if they wanted to, at any point just cut your business off, even though they usually don't do it. But the fact that they're in this position where they can do it, and they decide who gets the loans, what type of businesses even get to exist, and it's like they're saying they're not going to create an industry that goes against their entrenched investments. So like, for instance, solar will never be made good as long as oil is still profitable, right? Electric cars will never be made good as long as gas powered cars are still profitable. And look, I'm not saying that we should have solar powered cars because obviously there's other problems with that, but you just get the example, right? Like, anything that's going to upset the old entrenched economic system, even if it is better for everybody else, it will not get pushed through because they control the system, and they're not going to allow something that's going to decrease their control or profit making in the system, even if it is better for everybody else. And you can see that mostly like in like the healthcare industry, where there's probably a lot of cures that they could come up with, but it's better for them to just reduce the side effects and get you on drugs and stuff that you have to continuously take for the rest of your life, rather than to present any type of preventative cures or things like that. So that's that section. I'll be back tomorrow, or probably later, with different videos, but tomorrow with this, checking out Germany. So thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this. Have a good day and peace.